In an age of scientific success, are we too prone to accept scientific theories as certainties? Should we always believe the scientist? Dr. William Newton Smith suggests that scientific theories progress because they give increasingly accurate accounts of natural phenomena. Dr. Hugh Mellor argues that science generates technologies and gives rise to universal laws with wide practical application. Barry Barnes believes that science changes rather than progresses as evidence is reinterpreted. They're questioned by Paul Sieghart.
If you read in your morning newspaper one day that the Prime Minister of the day, and never mind who it is at the moment, has just made a speech saying, hard work is good for you, and it will be a jolly sight better for all of you if you worked a 12-hour day instead of a 6, 7, or 8-hour day, how many of you would believe it? Not one hand goes up. Well, I'm not surprised. If you read in your daily newspaper that a distinguished team of scientists, having done an enormous amount of research, had established that people who worked a 12-hour day lived on average 4 years longer and had a decidedly healthier life, needed fewer drugs and fewer attendances at hospital than people who worked 6, 7, or 8-hour days, how many of you would believe it? 1, 2. Oh, come on, must be more than that. 3.
Could I say?
Please.
Could I say, it depends what you mean by working day. I mean, I consider myself that I'm up at 7 a.m. and I'm working through till 7 p.m., but not doing the same job.
And you look remarkably healthy from here. But the point I'm really trying to establish is, if you read it as coming from scientists who have really done a lot of independent research and finally come up with that result, am I right in thinking you find it more credible than if it comes from a politician?
No.
All right. Most say more credible. Barry Barnes, is it more credible?
Well, it's more credible in the sense that politicians have their vested interests, and we see scientists as having fewer vested interests or being coupled less strongly to vested interests.
When you say we see them as having fewer vested interests, are you perhaps suggesting that that's a misperception?
I don't think it is a misperception, although I think as science has got more bound up with application and utility, it's become more bound up with vested interests than it formerly was. So that, for example, today, the great majority of scientists don't have full freedom of speech. They work in situations where they have to have a mind to their employer's interests and to the company or the government that ultimately they are working for. And the result is that as we've made more use of science, we've put its credibility at risk to an extent. And as we make more and more use of science, we're going to be inclined to trust scientists less and less. They're going to start appearing on the media rather like party politicians do, with one for the nuclear power industry and one against.
But are you saying that if scientists come under greater pressure, and if they appear on the media more and they seem to be making propaganda, they'll lose a degree of credibility which they really ought to have if they don't compromise it?
I'm saying that academic scientists who aren't bound in with industry or government are going to be seen as more disinterested than those employed in industry and government, and we're going to trust them more, and indeed we'll be right to trust them more. And it's perhaps unfortunate that the old ideal of the academic scientist who we can trust because he or she is disinterested, that ideal is less well realized in the modern world than it was.
Okay. Hugh Mellor, interest apart, pressures on people to say things which, if they were truly independent and academic, they mightn't say with quite such certainty, that apart, should we believe scientists more when they tell us something about ourselves or the outside world than we believe other people, like politicians, philosophers, I don't know, anybody else?
Well, it's more reason for believing someone who, if he's talking about the moon, has been looking through a telescope than someone who hasn't been looking through a telescope. And the characteristic of a scientist is...
Or somebody who's been there.
Or someone who's been there. Anyway, getting yourself in a good position to see what it is. Now, I wanted to remove the mud as well. I wanted to remove it by pointing out that interest comes in what subjects you look into. The disinterestedness of a scientist should come in to how whatever he looks into is looked into and what criteria he applies, or she, of course, for deciding whether they've found out something.
Bill Newton Smith, is a scientist inherently more credible when he's reporting, he or she, is reporting their scientific results than anybody else who goes public with a proposition about the world or human beings?
Yes, with qualifications. I mean, if a scientist says something completely bananas, like the Earth is flat at this stage, then we can set that aside. But if he doesn't say something...
If you'd lived in the 16th century, you wouldn't have given Galileo much time, would you?
Delivered the goods over the last 200 years. I mean, since Galileo. What did you mean by...
Well, hang on. There was a time when everybody, not just believed, knew the Earth was flat and that the sun went round it. They thought they knew it. And the guy comes along and says, actually, counterintuitive, you would never believe me, chaps, it's round and it goes round the sun. Had you lived at that time, could you conceivably have believed it?
Well, I would like to think I'd have gone over to his side quickly, but I think at the time there were considerations for and against. A matter of theory choice involves an element of gamble. I mean, in the long term, one theory, I would say, is better than another if it delivers predictions and explanations. But at the time at which you've got to make the choice, you may not have the evidence. So there's an element of gamble.
Somebody wanted to come in there, please.
One of the problems that our scientists have got is that they've got what we call in Scotland a braw conceit of themselves. They think because they have worked things out, it's all going to be just so. It doesn't work out that way.
I think one has become so used to getting a different theory the week after, negating everything that was said the week before, that one has become as skeptical about believing things that scientists say as one hears from politicians.
As skeptical?
Yes.
Do you mean when you hear something as being reported as science has just established so-and-so, you automatically say to yourself,
Next week someone will come and disprove it.
In some sense, scientists are awfully fickle. Their theories come and in a couple of hundred years they're always gone. But they don't sort of come and go in sort of weekly intervals. And when they go, they don't go totally. I mean, we still say Einstein, okay, he's better than Newton, but Newton got an awful lot of things right. So that the theories that replace them often contain the successes of the previous theory.
It seems to me that science is, as an individual pursuit, a lot less esoteric than we've been making it. I think it is actually as an individual activity of anyone, simply part of the process of trying to find out things and explain them. What makes it interesting and special is that it gets institutionalized. And the point about the institution is that it should embody, and to some extent does embody, a device to counteract the tendency that was referred to believe what you want to believe or what you start off believing. And the reason why scientists habitually contradict each other in the short range is that you have laboratories and institutions competing with each other. I mean, if you're being cynical, you could say they're competing for the Nobel Prize, but the institution as a whole has an element of competition which does institutionally help to weed out by mistakes that would just be confirmed if people could go on and support themselves.
This is the market theory of scientific truth,
Yes, it is partly, except that the market, there's no difference between the consumers and the producers in this case. But the point is you can reconcile all of that with the recognition that this institution over the years has delivered an awful lot of knowledge which we simply didn't have before, and the evidence for that is contained in all around this studio and in the possibility of making this program.
Forgive me.
The problem is to explain why it works.
Knowledge or technology?
Well, technology whose workings would be incredible if it were not based on knowledge of the mechanisms by which it works.
Please, you wanted to come in.
it strikes me that what the scientists should be doing is to offer the uneducated masses like myself some criteria against which to judge their theories. Now, having used that phrase, you must have some criteria against which you judge what is reasonable and unreasonable. Now, you have the expertise to make that judgment. How do you suggest I judge, because I have no scientific knowledge, or little scientific knowledge?
First, no scientist should ever claim, and I doubt if few would claim, that they proved a theory to be true. We've got enough evidence from history to know that even our most favorite theories today are going to turn out to be inadequate somewhere. So they're going to advance a much more cautious claim.
Okay, not true, but the best available theory.
Yeah.
So the best available theory is the one that is held by the best available scientists at any given time.
No, the best available theory is the one that shows the best sign of giving the greatest predictions. They could make a mistake. Right. I mean, they could all plump for one theory.
Trust in scientists is prior to the trust in their evidence.
Oh, no.
Because the only people who are actually gathering and evaluating the evidence are the scientists themselves. And when your questioner asked, how was she to know? How was she to know from the outside whether to believe or not to believe? All you can say to her with your view is trust the scientists.
Oh, no. There's a time lag here. The way it works is that the scientific community delivers the evidence in the form of the television cameras in a way of technological spin-off and predictive successes. We then come to have some faith in them because they have delivered the goods. We then come to rely on that institution because it's providing evidence that it's working. We come to rely on the assessments that the scientists make themselves in open competition with one another. I mean, if the whole thing started to grind to a halt and we didn't get anything out of all their predictions were dismal, then we might well wish to open the question as to whether they were fairly testing the theories. Maybe they've gone over to being influenced by sociological factors.
Can I come in on this? It seems to me there is an important difference between science and other activities, including generally technology, which is, the difference is that, roughly speaking, science is not a spectator sport, and technology is. I mean...
Well, it is for us non-scientists.
Well, that's right, it is, but so, for instance, are languages. You can't criticize someone else's French unless you can speak French. You can criticize a novel without being able to write such a novel. Literature and technology are essentially spectator sports. They are for, and their success is to be judged by people who are not in the business. But science, like mathematics, indeed I'd say like philosophy, is not a spectator sport. If you want really seriously to come to your own judgment about some area of science, you have to get into it. There's no substitute for that. But that's not a peculiar problem. I mean, 90%...
Otherwise you have to take it on trust.
Yes, you have to take it on trust, but 90% of what we believe we take on trust. I mean, that any of this stuff here is going to result in a television screen somewhere else. I'm taking on trust, as is almost everybody here.
Elaborate practical
and there's nothing mysterious about that. It becomes mysterious and is apt to generate paranoia if you think that the institution of science is like the sort of priestly institution, which there is some special mysterious qualification for getting into, or a ritual, and it really isn't. I would go back to what Barry Barnes said. It is simply an institution for doing collectively, and to some extent competitively, to counter our natural tendency to gullibility, what all of us do quite a lot of the time, which is finding things out and trying to explain them.
Of course, the trouble is that things may be thought to be settled for about 200 years, and along comes Einstein, and it turns out it was all wrong all the time.
That's what makes science exciting.
Yeah.
And
of course, I disagree with
should encourage our skepticism. I'm sorry, just before you come in,
yes.
Somebody anxious to come in here, please.
The thing that seems to be overlooked here is the fact that scientists are doing a job like anyone else, and because they're doing a job, there are pressures on them. Barry Barnes raised this when he mentioned scientists out with the academic field. But even within academic communities, the way you judge theories is on the basis of whether they're going to let you get through next week doing your job. So that it's not their philosophical, high-minded, predictive ability to predict this or that, which you can't actually do in your lab.
How do you choose your theories?
I'm choosing my theories on the basis that I've seen reports that they work. I never go into an experiment with the belief that it's not going to work.
Please.
There seems to be two problems here. First of all, scientists are able to falsify results, and that isn't a property of scientists. Anybody can do that. Politicians do it, and they seem to do it all the time. The other problem is that you take an example of an advertisement starting that it has been scientifically proved. That isn't a problem of science. That's a problem of reporting scientific results, and a problem with the media. And I think this anti-science feeling that I'm feeling here as well is as a result of people not talking to scientists, and I don't think there are any scientists who would say, we have proved this. I think it's talking to media people. You hear it from television, you read it in the papers, because it makes a good story that it's been proved that eating sugar is wrong for you. I don't think the scientist who did the work would ever state eating sugar is wrong for you.
Sceptical member of the audience wants
Yes,
to come back,
I
please.
would like to make the point about this probability factor in life. Now, I once heard it was said, if you eat salt, and you eat sugar, and you drink, and you smoke, you'll die anyway, but if you don't do any of these, you won't die of anything serious. No, I mean, this is the scientists. They are frightening us out of our wits.
But if you're old enough, you'll have watched those fashions come and go.
I know,
about
that's
foods
exactly what
and
happened.
drinks and lifestyles and jogging and all that kind of thing.
There's
And
more
from-
people not dead jogging.
And from the maturity of our advanced years, we can say, oh yes, that's another fad, let's not bother to join it. But do you think that there is actually a danger in proposals of that kind being put forward allegedly with the authority of scientific research that is being conducted in some great laboratory or university?
Well, I think many of the proposals, what you just mentioned, the reason that one should be sceptical of them is that they are being put forward very often by interested parties. That is, the reason for being sceptical about arguments about sugar and other artificial sweeteners a few years ago is that it turned out that some of the publicity about this was attributable to interests that had to do with either with the sugar industry or the chemical industry. Now that really is, I think, I mean, although it's a very serious question, is a separate question. And one is right to be sceptical about these matters. But can I just go back to the vision about probability? I think, not to the technical question about whether confidence limits are probabilities, though I'd like to say two things relating that. One is that that's a very good illustration of the fact that there are serious questions in science which really cannot be put just into English. And if an average intelligent person wants to find out about them, they can, but they will have to learn something first. And that's very reasonable.
Cannot be put into English?
Yes, I mean, you can't write quantum theory out in ordinary English. And anyone who thought that you could would be imposing an absurd demand on that kind of theorizing. In order to understand that subject, you have to produce a rather sophisticated mathematical language which people who want to understand theory have to learn, and that's that.
But are you saying that once it is possible to conceive of something in a new calculus, mathematical calculus, that doesn't actually reflect a category of thought, a pattern of thought, which it is possible to have without actually using the symbols?
Yes.
You are? Mathematics is really independent of the way in which human minds work.
Of course not.
Yes.
But it may be that to work in certain ways, you need mathematics. And that's what the human mind has to invent mathematics. The limitations of the human mind limit the mathematics we can invent. It's a myth that there is ordinary language which everybody understands and in which everything could really be said. And then there is something completely esoteric, which is like mathematics, which is used as a device by scientists to keep the public out.
That's a myth.
It is a myth.
Right. So
and what's more, it's not true.
And the truth?
I mean, just pointing to Barry's distinction.
So what is true in this?
Well, what is true is, of course, that there is a temptation for people who do want to be overly mysterious about things to pretend that things can't be translated when they can. And I do think that it is an obligation on scientists to explain what can be explained, and actually a lot do. If you take publications like New Scientist or Scientific American, there are good people working at this business, a necessary business, of explaining the gist of things to people but who are outside the community. But there is no doubt that there is a limit to the extent to which this can be done, and the limit is not set by the perversity of the people in the business. It is set by the fact that certain results need concepts and mathematical and other devices for expressing them, which people do not have unless they get into the business.
But either way, whether it's correct or not, whether it's just difficult or whether it's impossible, I think Hugh Mellor must be right that we can't shift trust away from the relationship between the scientist and the public. Trust has got to exist as the basis for the credibility of science. And if we trust, we can't really ask why we're trusting and expect good reasons, because the good reasons that the scientist would give would only make sense to us if we were in a position where we didn't need to trust him. Therefore, whether or not we trust science is going to depend on things that aren't to do with the technicalities of science, but are going to do with the context in which science sits. Basically, the more we like science, the more we're going to trust it. And the more we associate it with things we don't like in society, the more we're going to distrust it. And this is what we actually find empirically, of course, that critics of science tend to be critics of the institutions with which science is associated in our modern societies. And those who defend science the most strongly, going beyond what a scientist himself might say into the realm of myth and talk about absolute truth and so on and so forth, and scientific method of an absolute kind. These are people who tend to also trust the institutions with which science is associated, and it's an interesting correlation.
Would you say that scientists are more credible, trustworthy than philosophers in what they say?
They're not trying to do the same thing.
Indeed.
And in the area in which the scientist is offering views, yes, I think the scientist is more credible than anyone else in the area in which he's offering his views.
More credible in his area than the philosopher would be in his?
Oh no, more credible than the philosopher offering views in the scientist area.
No. Is the scientist offering views in the scientist area
yes.
more credible than you would be offering philosophical views in your area of philosophy?
It's not clear that you can make these comparisons, but
Try.
if I really had to, I'd say the scientist is probably more reliable. Philosophy is just too much more difficult and harder to be confident.
Who's more reliable, scientist or
Well,
philosopher?
certainly if you don't trust scientists in a modern society, I wouldn't advise you to trust philosophers either, because philosophers have modelled themselves an awful lot on the practice of scientists themselves, and have sought to emulate the sciences in so many ways that it would be a pointless exercise to trust the philosophers more.
Hugh Mellor?
Well, I think that, I'm afraid the answer to your question is yes and no, rather trivially. I mean, that is...
It would be, wouldn't it?
that as far on points of integrity, I think I trust my colleagues as much as scientists trust each other. In terms of institutional pressure, I agree with Bill that there is more reason for there to be pressure and more need to resist it in the case of science, because science is related to technologies in a way in which philosophy is not immediately.
And is much more expensive to fund.
And is much more expensive, and therefore more turns on whether the money is being well spent, because there's more money at stake. So I feel much privileged in being in a subject in which my mistakes matter less, and therefore I need to worry less about making them.
Would you all agree on at least one thing, and that is that in the case of scientists, as much as anybody else, it behoves us to maintain a healthy skepticism about what they report to us before we finally regard it as established? Yes?
I think a healthy skepticism is always a good thing.
Certainly, although I can't think of any promising alternative sources of knowledge to suggest by way of replacement.
I agree, a healthy skepticism in all things. Not especially for the philosophers, but for everything.
Well, I think on that note of agreement, we can put an end to this discussion, because for once, we've actually reached total agreement amongst all three participants. Thank you.